Farmers today are facing rising costs, volatile markets, and extreme weather. The A Better Way to Farm podcast digs into strategies to help you take control of farm inputs and maximize profit so your farm can thrive for generations. Remember to take advantage of our free resources at abetterwaytofarm.com. Now, from America's Heartland, here's your host.
Today, we're going to work on day 9 of the 12 days of nutrients, and we're going to talk about chloride and moly both. We'll be starting with chloride and talking about some of the things there in chloride versus chlorine, trying to get some merit on what that looks like and what we want to do. And so as we start looking at this, the first place I want to go is into the hands-on agronomy, but I'm going to do that after I read from this some stuff that I just printed off. I went online and did some other things here, and as we start talking about chlorine and chloride, and some people use those interchangeably, and I understand why. As a matter of fact, in a couple of the resource books that I looked at by guys who are PhDs, I saw them using chlorine and chloride interchangeably, which is not exactly correct. However, it's close enough. I can see how they got there and where they came from that. But here's the deal. The first question is, can chloride be converted into a chlorine gas? And the answer is yes, it can. It's not super common, but it can happen under typical environmental conditions. And what happens is we have chloride, which is Cl minus. It's a negatively charged ion, which is it is a form of chlorine and a form of chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is Cl2 in its elemental form. Chloride is much more stable and commonly found in things like sodium chloride, table salt, potassium chloride, salt for your cornfield. And to convert that, it requires oxidation. To change that chloride into the chlorine gas, we have to lose electrons. And that typically requires an external energy source or a strong oxidizing agent. Electrolysis is one of the ways they can do it. The presence of water and electricity, in other words, a lightning strike during a storm with rain, is going to do that. And here's the real situation from where I sit, and one of the reasons why I'm not real big on lots of chloride out there. We're going to talk about what it does, and it's an important element. However, most of these books, actually all of these books that have anything to say about it, say it's very rarely found to be deficient, that we always have more than enough. And they talk a lot more about toxicity than they do being deficient. But the fact of the matter is, when chloride loses that electron and it comes back to chlorine, now it is a gas, no different than oxygen or hydrogen. And the problem with it is that chlorine gas is very heavy. And so when chloride becomes a chlorine gas in your cornfield or your bean field, it's heavy, so it stays down on the ground in the lower 8 to 12 inches. That's where it just hangs out at until it dissipates. But when it hangs down there, guys, it's a poison. And that is not good for our plants. And on those times when we do get chloride converting back into that chlorine gas, then all of a sudden we're going to be looking at an amount of oxygen, air contaminated with a pure poison that those plants are having to get in there, and all of a sudden that has a effect on what's going to happen there with how well those crops do. And you know, our goal is that no crop ever have a bad day. I'm going to do a program somewhere here down the road, a podcast or something on aluminum. We've had some interesting things come up. Had an individual who was getting a product sold to them that had very low NPK and actually had almost 7% aluminum in it, and so he was putting on 2,000 pounds to the acre, so that would be 140 pounds of aluminum that he was putting on. I'm not going to get into why that's bad today, but I will later. But I will say this: aluminum and chloride have some interaction, and chloride, while present in the soil, it's not directly linked to aluminum toxicity. However, chloride should be a concern in certain soil types, particularly when there's high concentrations due. And it will impact and actually exacerbate the idea of having an aluminum toxicity in there. Chloride, again, Cl negative charge, is an ion, meaning it has gained an extra electron, giving it that negative charge. Chlorine is a neutral molecule. It's composed of 2 chlorine atoms that are bonded together. And to convert chloride to chlorine, the chloride ion must lose that extra electron. And that is typically done through oxidation, where the chloride gives up that extra electron and then becomes chlorine. The two atoms do go together and make that chlorine molecule, which is listed as Cl2. And so, yes, it can jump back and forth between the two. Chloride is actually produced from chlorine. And as we start looking at it, what does chloride do for us? Why do we need it? Well, we want to make sure it's important for stock strength. It's important for disease resistance. It's probably the reason that everybody says, well, there was that one test on wheat in Kansas, and they put chloride on and they got a yield increase. And I'm guessing that was because they happened to be deficient in it. And it really helps with disease resistance, especially in wheat. It's important for photosynthesis and water regulation, but as you well know, being a salt, in excess, it causes plasmosis, which means it actually takes water away from the plant and robs it from the plant. And so therefore, all of a sudden, we take a lot more moisture than what we need. It can cause ion toxicity, and that's going to damage the plant cells and interfere with nutrient uptake, leading to deficiencies. So hear me out. Again, we have a nutrient that actually impacts every other nutrient, because in excess, chloride messes with the cells and it really interferes and inhibits nutrient uptake, leading to deficiencies of basically all the other essential nutrients. Again, it's formed from chlorine, and it is an ion of that, and it has that one more electron than the chlorine has. Once we go through that oxidation process, it switches back. As I launch off into what Neil has to say about it, and there's not a lot written in a lot of these different books, but I do want to talk here briefly about what he has found. And he talked about the fact that he had a client who was reported that his soil was as hard as concrete. And again, when I get into really hard soil, I often think too much magnesium, but that was not the case here. He could only get his thumb to go into about the thumbnail, and it was hard from there on. They had extreme amounts of both sodium and chloride here, and what happened was it made the soil so tight that they couldn't penetrate it. And so in excess, obviously everything is bad, and it is really easy to get an excess of chloride. If chlorine comes in the atmosphere, we're getting a lot of that out of the rain, because obviously those lightning strikes do free it up, and in the presence of water, there it is. And so that's dropping some chlorine down there, which will immediately should turn back into chloride and become available that way, we would hope. But we are getting plenty, and we don't need any excess. Also looking in here, let's consider the trace element of chlorine. It is more, and here he is using chlorine instead of the word chloride. But anyway, it is more recent addition to the list of essential nutrients. Chlorine in the soil, in the form agronomists talk about, is chloride, and it plays a role in photosynthesis. Common deficiency symptoms are leaf tip wilt, leaf corrosis, and necrosis. And he goes on to talk about some of the things that have been done studying this, and he really has an interesting take on a lot of studies that are done. There's a lot of science. It's not great science that's done out there. And he said, now all of a sudden we have scientists coming along saying that chloride gives a response in wheat production and various other crops. And what I wonder is, since many researchers do not understand and may even reject base saturation percentages, they deal with soils that are below 2% potassium saturation. Is it actually the potassium that's given the response? Well, we're giving the credit to the chloride. He's talking about people who've applied 0060. And what he based that on was he had farmers who were using 0060 and getting a yield increase because they did it, but then he came back and some of them went to using 005017, which is potassium sulfate, which has virtually no chloride, and yet they still got the same result. See, we were giving credit to the wrong thing. We were giving credit to something that really wasn't doing it. It was the potassium. And when we change two things, guys, in any test, that's what we have to be aware of, is that we possibly are drawing the wrong conclusion. As we look in here at our little Western book to talk about what does it look like when you're deficient, chlorine is the latest element established as an essential micronutrient. In plant life, it is believed to stimulate the activity of enzymes and to influence carbohydrate metabolism and the production of chlorophyll, the water holding capacity of plant tissue, and it affects that both ways. When we have the right amount, it helps it, and when we have too much, it really diminishes that water holding capacity. Generally, there is no deficiency in chlorine in soils except in the humid regions. Normal rainfall supplies sufficient chlorine to maintain that normal supply. And so as we start looking at How we're going to get this, basically it's one nutrient that's still coming for free in the rain. It's still showing up. And so do we want to have it? Yes, we do. Do we want to have too much? No, we don't. And I think it's worthy sometimes of maybe doing some tissue testing and seeing what those levels are versus what they should be. I'm going to switch gears and move out of the chloride. I'm going to go into the moly. And as we start talking about molybdenum here, this is a product that it's interesting because I get a lot of, it's kind of a new thing. And so I get people who get all jacked up. Oh, we tried some Moly last year and we got blah, blah, blah. And then the one guy who I totally respect and was doing a lot of really good research got tremendous results one year. The very next year got nothing. Absolutely zilch. And so he was very frustrated trying to figure out, why that didn't happen. But Midwest Labs talks about the fact that molybdenum is needed for the symbiotic fixation of nitrogen by legumes. It is vital for the reduction of nitrates and the synthesis of protein in all plants. I'm going to say this again and again. You're going to hear it multiple times. Having the right amount of moly is really important because you guys, you've heard me talk about the fact that it is believed that a corn plant will take in nitrate or ammonium in. However, it prefers a 50-50 mix. And if we get too much nitrate in the soil, if that conversion has already happened, then we have to convert it back into ammonium. And A, that takes energy. But B, it also takes moly. And if we happen to be moly deficient, then we're going to have a hard time converting that nitrate back into that ammonium N that we want to get. And so it's one of the things that you're going to hear us talk about multiple times as we go through here because it is an important nutrient, but we've got a lot to learn about it before we go off and make crazy ideas. They also talk about the fact that one of the shortages that you would find in moly, your plants lack vigor and they're a light green in color. The symptoms look very close to a nitrogen deficiency. Why? Because a lack of moly probably is a nitrogen deficiency, a lack of ammonium in nitrogen deficiency. In non-legumes, a moly shortage may look like excess nitrate. In other words, we don't have enough moly, we can't convert the nitrate back into ammonium, and all of a sudden our leaves turn yellow, and in spots where the nitrate accumulates in between the veins and along the leaf margins, they may curl up or cup upwards or become distorted, often developing a little more than the midrib, a narrow, wavy green stripe on either side. And so actually what happens is that we're creating a nitrate toxicity when we have an absence of necessary moly. And again, another source that I found online talked about the fact that moly is a component of enzymes that helps convert nitrates to ammonium. And I circled that and I highlighted it and I drew arrows to it because it's really important. But here's the thing. This is why I'm nervous. You can do a soil test through Midwest Labs and they can talk to you about your moly availability. However, part of it has to do with pH, so that's important to keep in mind. But a 250 bushel corn crop needs 13 1,000th of a pound of moly per acre. In ounces, that's 2/10 of 1 ounce is all that it needs to grow 250 bushel corn. Now, moly does become, it's kind of unique because it becomes more available as the pH increases. And a lot of times growers will see a moly deficiency, and this is where it can get a little interesting because we test our soil, we have moly, but our pH is down below 6.2, and now it starts to become not available. And so here we are again, one nutrient impacting another. The amount of calcium that we have is going to impact whether or not we can get that moly into that plant. We're going to talk about in relationship to copper as well. So there's a lot of things here that moly does, but it's important to understand, guys, everything matters. I've been working on some soil tests here the last couple of days, helping Kayla. We were looking at some soil tests with pHs of 5.6, 5.7, and 5.8. And guys, yes, we're going to put some calcium in the seed trench. Yes, we're going to give that baby plant some available calcium. But we really need to get that calcium right in that soil. The pH was low. The base saturations, some of them were under 50%. And we've got to go to work on those and fix that. And that was in moly and corn that I was reading about. Now I went in and did moly and beans. It's a key component in the nitrogen fixing process in soybeans. It allows the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soybeans root nodules to convert nitrogen gas from the atmosphere into a form that the plant can use. It also helps the plant absorb phosphorus and potassium. So here we are, moly impacting nitrogen conversion, impacting phosphorus and potassium absorption. And what does a deficiency look like in a soybean? Kind of similar to a nitrogen deficiency, including pale green plants, leaf veins that are not prominent, and older leaves that turn pale or turn yellow. Why? Because a lack of moly actually does lead to a lack of nitrogen. When we take a look here at our little yellow Western fertilizer book, just so we can talk about what do those deficiencies look like, because I think that's a great resource to have. It's also in the back of the Midwest Labs book. Moly, again, is associated with nitrogen utilization. Very small amounts are needed. Plants containing an excess of this element are toxic to livestock. Moly deficient plants are stunted in yellow in color, closely resembling nitrogen deficiency. And so when we start looking at those things, the moly is tied so closely to all of that. And we want to make sure that we're getting it in the right amounts. We don't want to over apply it. That's why we think we need to do the soil test. We've got some studying to do on how does pH impact that, and how's that going to affect what happens when we go out here and apply it. Moly will remain available at a pH close to 7. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping that pH where we want it, but it definitely wants to be above 6.2 if we're going to have any success with the Moly product. Getting in there, we need to have that good pH. And fixing pH, guys, is way better than coming in here and over applying other nutrients like Moly that we don't really need if we have our pH correct. It is the only micronutrient in which availability goes up as the increases as the pH goes up. Super important to your nitrogen fixing bacteria in legumes. And Moly should not be applied when copper levels are deficient. Now here we are talking about how does Moly impact copper. And the fact of the matter is, if copper is deficient, putting Moly on will exacerbate that and make it worse. So if we're going to be applying Moly, we need to know what that copper level is and say, do we need to apply more copper? And in the case, probably. We really need to be looking at that because it's going to make a significant difference in the success that we have when we apply that right amount of copper with that right amount of Moly. It's always interesting to me to go back and review and restudy and look at how all these different things interact with each other and why it's important to get it all right. When crops on soils with adequate fertility that test low in copper fail to respond to copper applications, a Moly test should be considered. In other words, if I know I got a copper deficiency and I didn't test for Moly and I applied copper and I didn't get a response, now I probably need to go the other way and say, now I've got to put a little bit of Moly on in order to get that copper in there. Everything matters, guys. We don't see a Moly deficiency very often. It's very interesting to me. I would like to see us develop a Moly product. However, that being said, we've got to get the science behind it down before we do that. Guys, chloride and Moly are not something that get a lot of time, a lot of attention. I think they're worthy of looking at. It's worthy to do the test and see where we are. I also think that these are two things that really can become, I'm way more worried about the toxicity of Moly and the toxicity of chloride than I am the toxicity of copper and boron. And that's where we hear that most of the time, is we hear people throwing around the toxicity in regards to the copper and the boron, and we just don't see that. And quite honestly, having these tests and learning about these other two products as chloride and Moly are probably really important. Guys, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll be coming back to you here with another day of nutrient really soon, and we will be talking to you as soon as we get the next day done.